Hello, my name is Arlene Sachs, and this is Sally Ann Sachs. And today we'd like to welcome Vadim Alskan and Ellen Hegen. Welcome, both of you. They're both from the Holocaust Museum, and we're going to talk about some of the new acquisitions that they have. Do you want to do a little bit of their introduction?
Well, what I wanted to say was, there's an article that's coming out in the spring issue of Avotenu that Vadim and Ellen have written. And we've got their bios, but it says that, Vadim, you are the Senior Project Director for the International Archival Programs Division at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. You direct archival research and the development of digital collections on the history of Jewish communities and the Holocaust in 22 countries, covering the Balkans, and so on. Tell me what that really means. What do you actually do?
Well, it's the whole process of learning about existence of the records, doing preliminary research, locating archives and other depositories where materials could be stored, kept, signing agreements of cooperations with various governments and government entities responsible for archives, finally reproduction and making these materials available to researchers.
And Ellen, you're the program coordinator with the International Archives Program and this division of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Mm-hmm. It sounds very much the same to me. And you've worked with Great Britain, Australia, Denmark, and so on. Exactly what's the difference? I mean, other than that you're working with different countries.
Well, different countries, and it's a much smaller scale. Vadim has kind of a huge range of countries where he's working, and so mine is a little bit more.
And also, yours are Slavic language countries primarily, yes?
Yes.
And of course, the Jewish population was much larger in those countries before the war.
Yes.
You told me when I spoke to you that a lot has happened in recent years in your under your purview. Do you want to tell us what you've been doing?
Well, the technology changed since I think we met last time. More and more we're digitizing materials rather than microfilming or using Xerox machine. We're working now also in several countries with professional commercial companies, which allows us to do more and not only efficiently but also quality-wise. We are getting better materials, better copies of the original resources. And because, as I mentioned, we're dealing with professional companies, they do all these projects much faster than archives themselves.
So now you've acquired a lot of material.
For example, from Ukraine in the last 6 years, I think we acquired about 6 million pages. So it's about 1 million pages per year, sometimes a little bit even more.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And you also told me that the span of years that you're covering was something that I hadn't expected. Do you want to explain that?
Well, it starts from, the way how we define this, it's interwar period between World War I and World War II, Holocaust, of course, which was always our primary task, and immediate post-war period. By immediate, we mean it can go even to mid-60s, depending on the scope of the collection, content of the collection, and the country.
And
what kind of material do you collect?
Well, when it comes to interwar period, it's limited to Jewish communities, history of Jewish communities, Jewish life, represented from both angles. Records of the Jewish communities, but also government records dealing with the history, dealing with Jews, individual Jews and Jewish communities, Jewish organizations.
Well, just to set it so the viewers can understand, the museum made this decision to go as early as 1919 and as late as the late 1950s, even though it's the Holocaust Museum. So tell us what the thinking is about why it's of interest to you to do the interwar period, for example, and then after.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It has to do with a very, I think, important idea. During the Holocaust, we're dealing not only with the destruction of individual Jews and Jewish communities, but also with the destruction of entire civilization. We're saying that we lost the world of European Jews, East European Jews. But it applies not only to Eastern Europe. The same I can say about Greece and other countries,
Right.
you know, Sephardic communities, and Western Europe. So to understand what kind of world was this, and what about culture, religious communities, we need to have records. You cannot understand what happened in Lithuania or Ukraine in 1941 without knowing what happened there in 1922 or 1939 or 1940. So we need this to not only for better understanding, but also for providing a historical context
Right.
to the whole history. So it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen sporadically. There was a prehistory, and what happened after is also part of this history.
And then I can talk, about, because a lot of the countries where I'm working, we're dealing with a lot of records in the post-war period. So records relating to displaced persons, immigration after the war, issues relating to restitution and reparations, and then in some cases, commemoration of the Holocaust by some of these communities, as well as survivor records and their testimonies and personal papers that we're finding.
Right. So the notion is you can't just say the Holocaust was this little event that happened and we take it, pop it out from the whole chain of history, the span of history. So you're saying we have to have the whole context to get the whole picture. Sure.
And you did mention when we were talking before that there was migration of Jews even before the Holocaust, that they were moved out of one country or the other, or
Oh, that was after
Well, it has
World
to do
War
with
I.
the World War I. You know, you have new states in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, you know. So former empire collapsed and people were not choosing, but they had to establish their citizenship with new countries. So you have a lot of movement within Europe, Eastern Europe mostly, because Western Europe was less affected by World War I displacement. And yes, you have a lot of paperwork. People are trying to establish their citizenship, their residency. So it's a very interesting and not very well studied period in Jewish history.
Oh, yeah. So those internal passport things where people came back and they had to show, I've seen some of those where they had to show that their family had lived there before. There was a lot of displacement.
Well, a good example is during World War I, you have deportations of Lithuanian Jews done by Jews who lived in Lithuania, wouldn't call them Lithuanians. At the time, Lithuania didn't exist, by Russian army because Jews were considered not to be loyal. So many of them were relocated or deported, I would use this word rather than relocation, to proper Russia. So after war was over and you have a Bolshevik revolution in Russia, many Jews who are originally from Kovno or Šiauliai, they are trying to get back, and they're coming back to a new state called
Right.
Lithuania.
Right.
So how you would prove that you're originally from there? So you had to show your old Russian passport. And so it was a whole procedure, but
Yeah, there were a lot of people moving around.
yeah, and the same I believe applies to countries where Ellen works.
And after the war.
Yeah.
Yours
After
is
the
more
war, sure.
after. So describe for us some of these documents that you said both government and community. Tell us, okay, how do you work? What's your plan? What do you acquire exactly?
Well, the most easiest part is, of course, records of the Jewish communities, as long as they are identified as such.
how do those records exist if the community was moved away? How did they get into an archive?
Well, it's again very good question, because even if a community disappeared as an entity, legal entity, it happened. We need to separate, we need to provide some kind of border. So you have independent states like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and then you have Soviet Russia or USSR. So the Jewish life in these two parts of Europe was quite different. There were no Jewish communities any longer. Big Jewish communities, official Jewish communities in Soviet Russia. while Jewish life, official Jewish life, with Jewish communities, organizations, schools, and everything else continued to exist. So you have many, many records, and I'm talking about, for example, Western Ukraine or Eastern Poland, depending, where you're standing, what you're facing. Former, Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia. So you have all varieties of Jewish organizations, cultural, Zionist, political, schools. So when you go to archives, if they are identified as Jewish school, Tarbut organization.
But how would a government archive get the Jewish records?
Because
the Jews didn't take them along with them?
No, of course not. Jews usually, when they move, they run or they take their personal belongings if they have time. Plus, those records don't really belong to anybody, individually, personally. So they belong to community, and it was a kind of, I think, rule. If something ceased to exist in those areas, government inherits. So it happened with the records. The same happened with the records of Jewish communities. And on one hand, we can say this is not right, this is not fair. On the other hand, all these records survived and actually available to us now only because they were inherited and kept.
I just thought of something. You said
by state archives.
The area where you've done a huge amount and continue is in Ukraine.
Right.
Not the Far Eastern where the Russians are, but where it's safe. I remember back in the days when there was still a Soviet Union and we didn't know anything and couldn't find out anything, we learned about something called the Vernadsky Library. And we learned that when Stalin I think Stalin closed the Jewish schools in the 1920s, a lot of material from the Jewish community was taken to the Vernadsky. Is it still there?
It's still there. It's one of the, I need to explain probably what is Vernadsky. It's a national library, scientific library of Ukraine. And it has a huge collection of what they call Judaica, starting from manuscripts going back to 15th, 16th century, Pinkasim, for example,
I didn't know that.
Protocol books, right, of the Jewish communities. So this library inherited many collections which were gathered by the Jewish ethnographic expedition run by Alskan, right before World War I. Also, some materials which were in other Jewish museums, closed, as you said. He didn't close schools, but Stalin, he didn't do this personally, but the Soviet government did this. In late 20s, there was a Jewish museum, small Jewish museum in St. Petersburg, Leningrad at the time, Odessa. So the idea was that since those places do not exist and you already have some big collection in Kiev, they moved certain things to Kiev. And as a result of it, you have a very large collection because Kiev, or Academy of Science of Ukraine, had one of the most important Jewish institutions at that time. It was called Cabinet of Jewish Proletarian Culture. How much proletarian it was, remains questionable, but it was one of the most important and one of few remaining Jewish institutions through entire history of pre-war Soviet Union and immediate post-war. I think it was closed in 1949.
So does the museum acquire anything from that?
Well, this is, again, a very difficult question. We're negotiating, seriously, as we speak. I will continue this tomorrow, discussion of how we would proceed. We managed to reach an understanding with the new administration, new director, or relatively new director of this institution. We plan to sign a memorandum of understanding. This Vernadsky Library also has a very interesting audio archive. You have these cylinders with recordings done in before World War I, during the expedition of Alskan. And the last one was done in 46, 47 with Holocaust survivors in Bukovina from Transnistria. So museum, I hope, would be able to reproduce those songs from
That's
the ghettos of
phenomenal.
Transnistria.
And I'll also add
Yeah.
about the Jewish community records. I mean, in some cases, they're very well kept. Certainly in Great Britain, Board of Deputies of British Jews is kept in the London Metropolitan Archives. There are a number of Jewish collections at Southampton University. So these are very well kept. But in some cases, you have them not so well kept, and nobody really knows about them. Certainly in Australia, the records of the aid organization that assisted Jewish refugees, case files and their collections are just kept in boxes. They're not properly stored, or so there's not really any access to these kind of collections.
You know, we're going to have a second show where we're going to focus on everything but Eastern Europe. So I want to pick Vadim's brain a little bit more here, if I could. So I believe you said the museum is interested in getting everything when it's a Jewish community collection. What about when it's government collections? What do you do
Well,
there?
then here you have to do a survey, what we call archival survey. So,
What kind of things do you look for?
well, for example, Department of Finance or school administration, we're not interested and we can afford to copy entire collection, which deals with all sorts of schools in this region or area. So we hire a local person, usually a graduate student with a good knowledge of history, local history, and they go through what is known as inventory for archival collections, selecting materials which could be relevant to what we are interested in, namely Jewish community or Jews, individual Jews. So if you have records dealing with taxation or real estate or court records, Jews, as any normal people, were not only scholars and
Right.
intellectuals, but also, business people. You have, criminal activities.
Courts. What about passport? There was a system of internal passports. Maybe there's still. Are there passports in these government collections?
Yes, of course. People, we're dealing actually not with internal passports. I think with passport which will allow a person to travel abroad. And because of the system, at least I know this in Romania and Poland, if you need to travel, every time you need to travel, for any reason, and it doesn't matter for how long you go, you need to apply for passport.
What did peddlers do? Like,
Peddlers?
like they did, you hear about the Jews that went from city to
This
city.
Yeah,
is
but that was inside the country. We're talking about if you went out.
People, if you are a businessman
After-
and you live in Poland, but you need to go for business to Romania or you're going on vacation, you need to get out and you need to apply and you need to submit all sorts of documents, probably providing information about your income, birth certificate. So at the end, you will receive your passport, and I believe, if I'm correct, after you return, you need to return passport.
That's what's so interesting.
Yeah.
You don't keep it the way, here we keep our passports until they aren't good, and then
American government
trashes them.
trusts their citizens, apparently, unless, they don't trust them and they revoke their passports. But apparently in Eastern Europe,
You had to and so those passports end up in archives?
Yes, many of them
marvelous.
retained by archives, by the Ministry or Department of the Ministry of Interior, which was involved in issuing and reissuing passports. Therefore, you can find original passports with photos and all sorts of family information, which I think genealogists would be happy to.
Speaking of genealogists being happy, we need to talk about how our viewers are going to get access. Yes.
I've been trying to get my word in that.
How? So
What do you have online, and what?
Well, the good news that people are interested in this subject don't need to go to Ukraine any longer, or Belarus, or maybe even to Australia. Records are here in the United States. It doesn't mean that you can click and type your name and you will get a document. This is unfortunately not the case. But many documents are already digitized. We have inventories, we have descriptions.
And that's what's online, the inventories, the
yes,
directories.
Actual records, it's not because, it would be very difficult for us to maintain such. We have about, 70
80 million
pages.
yeah.
But also many source archives, what we call original archives in Ukraine, Australia, and other places. They don't want to have their records online before they put them online. Otherwise it basically eliminates needs of their existence. Therefore, you can find description of the collection, you can find inventories, and what you need to do is to send email or send letter, fax. We still have fax machines in the museum. And you can send this information or request to department, not our department, but department which deals with reference.
The Holocaust Survivor and Victim Resource Center.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and that's where they write to at the Holocaust Museum, and I guess you have that address or email on your webpage.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the webpage is just
.org.
ushmm.org, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And you just use those initials, .org, for any viewers that want to get online and look at it. And then if somebody found something or found an area, then they write to you for a specific document, or would they have to hire someone to come in?
Well, it depends, we have also very limited staff.
Yeah.
Not all of them, I have to admit, know all necessary languages, have linguistic skills. We're dealing with documents in Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Romanian, and
Now, with your index, though, that's transliterated to the English letters?
Yes, if there is an index, yes.
Inventory,
Inventory, yes. It will be not online if it's not translated, but if it's something complex and requires more than an hour, I believe, for research, yes, I would advise people to hire somebody local in,
Right.
and do this work for.
Actually, probably, if somebody's watching us from Australia, write to the Jewish Genealogy
Yes,
Society here in
absolutely.
Washington and say,
Or in Melbourne or Sydney, because they
yeah,
certainly
how
have.
can they can facilitate it. But then there's one more thing before we don't have time that I think is the most important thing for genealogists, and that's the projects that you're happy to have undertaken that you aren't doing, but that the genealogy groups are doing, such as Gesher Galicia. Can you tell the viewers what's that all about? What are they doing?
Well, you have, in some cases, you have collections, which I would call only like names collections, and like passport applications or census or something where, you basically don't have any other records except names.
Right.
And as I said, we cannot place this collection online and make it available through our website. Therefore, the best way to approach this collection, even if we place this on web, you understand, people will be not able to go through 300 or 400,000 pages.
Right.
So the best way to approach this complex problem is to create name index, which will identify everyone whose, let's say, passport application we have. And then using this information and cross-reference to actual records, our colleagues at the museum would be able very quickly to identify actual records. I'm talking about
Right.
archival records, and send this information to a person who is interested in it.
So Gesher Galicia is doing that, but we know that Jewish Gen has many groups that are focused on a particular district or even a city. If somebody goes through the catalog and sees that you have the Jewish community records or you have the passport records, and for this little town, and they want to, they can get access, they can arrange to have access to that collection somehow and make an index. How do they do it?
The way I think Gesher Galicia works with a lot of volunteers who come from the same area. I mean, they don't come in, their ancestor came from the same area. I will give you another example. We have about 2 million pages now from northern Bukovina, which had about 50,000 Jews before the war.
Right.
So it was a very large and important community.
Was that where Chernovitz is?
Chernovitz, yeah. The capital is at Chernovitz. And so you have all sorts of records there. So if anybody is interested, they can talk to me, but also, to my colleagues in the resource center. We can make copies of the collections with, of course, on one condition: they cannot retain those copies.
They must return them.
They must return to the museum. And so if they have volunteers interested in this particular project, they can.
That's just opens up a huge possibility for groups to recreate who lived in these Jewish communities right before they were destroyed.
I
But-
think it's important to get that on the Jewish Gin and to all of the special
Well,
SIGs on.
They all can just, it's coming out in Albertano, maybe, let's hope.
But
We'll talk about it some more.
But that's the way to get, whether
Tremendous.
most people have of course your subscription to Avotano, but then some others only have
Right.
get it online. Get that information out. That
It's absolutely up to you to deliver this great message.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then the final question I have, Yad Vashem does not have the same exact material. Or some of it they do.
Some of them they do, some of them they don't.
Okay, but somebody sitting in Israel who wants to do an index can apply to the museum here.
We don't
From
discriminate.
Any place in the world can
Yes.
apply to the museum.
Including people in Ukraine and Chernovitz.
Oh yeah, have you ever been? Oh, you've been to
Yes,
Chernovitz.
of course,
My
many.
best memory of Chernovitz is this cemetery that looks like the deepest Australian 100-million-year-old rainforest. It's so overgrown.
It's much better now. There's
Oh, yeah?
a group of volunteers who
Oh, they
clean
took
it up.
they took off some Roundup and killed the weeds.
yes. It's,
Oh, you couldn't even penetrate it. Yeah, when I saw it. Yeah. Oh, well, that's good to know.
Well, it's really interesting to see how much things have changed in the last few years at the Holocaust Museum, and what we can do with the modern technology that we couldn't even think of doing before asking a group like Gesher Galicia or
Or any of the other special interest groups.
yeah. I mean, I really hope that they get with it and start doing something.
Well,
like
I think it's really to the museum's credit that it's making itself available to have this cooperation and
absolutely.
interaction. It's fabulous that you're doing that, I think.
Well, thank you very much for appearing on the show today.
Keep working.
I